The devious rebrand of antisemitism. There is a particular kind of Jewish communal statement that reads like it was written by a committee, edited by a therapist, approved by a political consultant, and then sprinkled with just enough moral seriousness to make everyone feel responsible without anyone feeling accountable. You know the genre: concerned, nuanced, deeply troubled, committed to democracy, opposed to hate, protective of free speech, allergic to clarity. It performs moral seriousness while protecting the coalition. The Nexus Project recently gave us a perfect specimen when it criticized what it called the divisive, hyperbolic, and aggressive response from parts of the Jewish community to Zohran Mamdani's election. Nexus warned that these responses feed efforts that purport to fight anti-Semitism while undermining democratic diversity and cross-communal partnership. Fine. Let's start with the part everyone should be able to say without needing smelling salts. Valid criticism of Israeli government actions is not anti-Semitism. Criticize Netanyahu, criticize Israeli ministers, criticize policies, criticize military decisions, criticize coalition politics, criticize settlements, criticize court reform. Israelis do this daily with the emotional restraint of a family arguing over who ruined the brisket. Jews do not believe every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. That straw man needs to be retired already. Bury it next to Jews control the weather and my favorite Jewish food is gefilte fish. But that is not where the debate ends. That is where the laundering begins. Because the question is not whether criticism of Israel can be legitimate. Of course it can. The question is whether anti-Zionism, as practiced in institutions, campuses, activist spaces, and progressive political networks, often functions as a permission structure for treating Jewish peoplehood as uniquely illegitimate, and it does. That is the argument Nexus repeatedly avoids. The Nexus document says that criticism of Zionism in Israel, opposition to Israel's policies, or nonviolent political action directed at the state of Israel and/or its policies should not, as such, be deemed anti-Semitic. It also says that paying disproportionate attention to Israel and treating Israel differently than other countries is not prima facie proof of anti-Semitism, and that opposition to Zionism or Israel does not necessarily reflect anti-Jewish animus. Look at the language: not as such, not prima facie, does not necessarily, not per se. This is not a definition, it is a hedge fund. A little qualifier here, a little escape hatch there, a legalistic velvet rope around the ugliest parts of modern Jew hate. Suddenly, the burden is no longer on the person or institution creating hostile conditions for Jews. The burden shifts to Jews to prove that the hostility is the correct vintage. Was it classical anti-Semitism? Did it mention horns, blood libel, banking, space lasers? Did the speaker explicitly say, "I hate Jews," preferably notarized and witnessed? No? Then please calm down, David. You are being divisive. This is the problem with frameworks that treat intent as sacred and impact as negotiable. No other minority is told, with such academic tenderness, that hostility toward the central symbols of their collective identity is probably fine unless the bigot fills out the proper paperwork. But Jews? We get footnotes. Nexus will identify obvious anti-Semitism when it shows up in its old uniform: a swastika on a synagogue, a conspiracy theory about Jewish control, a Jew attacked because he is visibly Jewish. Good, that matters. But modern anti-Semitism got more devious. It learned activist language. It learned academic language. It learned DEI language. It learned to say Zionist with the same sneer previous generations used for Jew. It learned to call Jewish sovereignty colonialism, Jewish self-defense genocide, Jewish fear fragility, Jewish students privileged, and Jewish identity suspect unless it comes pre-disavowed. And when Jews point this out, Nexus often rushes in to remind everyone not to overreact. How helpful. The Nexus Campus Guide makes the problem even clearer. It says that slogans like "from the river to the sea" have starkly divergent responses and require context. It says that if freeing Palestine from the river to the sea entails eliminating Jews or relegating them to second-class status, then yes, that vision is anti-Semitic. It treats intifada as a term that literally means shaking off and has come to connote resistance to oppression, especially Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. Again, notice the move. A slogan that many Jews hear as eliminationist gets placed on the interpretive massage table. A chant soaked in Jewish memory gets aromatherapy. A word associated with waves of suicide bombings, murdered civilians, blown up buses, and Jewish trauma becomes a vocabulary lesson. Actually, intifada literally means actually. Yes, and final solution literally sounds like a productivity hack if you remove enough context. Context matters. Of course it does. Jews invented arguing about context. We have entire libraries of rabbis disagreeing with other rabbis who are disagreeing with dead rabbis over whether one word in a sentence changes the law. But context cannot become a magic eraser. The problem is not that Nexus says context matters. The problem is that its framework often places the burden on Jews, students, administrators, and institutions to prove eliminationist intent rather than acknowledging that some slogans now carry that meaning through their dominant contemporary use. If Jewish students are being told Zionists are not welcome, if High Halesia are vandalized, if Jewish institutions are targeted because they are connected to Israel, if Jews are asked to disavow Jewish sovereignty as the price of belonging, then the problem is not Jewish oversensitivity. The problem is anti-Zionist bigotry with institutional permission. This is where IRU, for all the criticism it receives, is far clearer. It explicitly recognizes that denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, such as claiming the existence of a state of Israel, is a racist endeavor, can be anti-Semitic. It also identifies double standards applied to Israel as a possible manifestation of anti-Semitism, while making clear that criticism of Israel, similar to criticism leveled against any other country, is not anti-Semitic. That is the philosophical difference. IRA treats the denial of Jewish self-determination as a recognized form of anti-Semitism. Nexus treats opposition to Zionism as presumptively non-anti-Semitic unless classic anti-Jewish animus can be separately proven. That is not a small disagreement over wording. That is the whole ballgame. Not Israel is above criticism. Israel is not above criticism. Israel is a country, a loud, messy, brilliant, infuriating, miraculous country where people argue like the fate of civilization depends on a parking spot in Jerusalem. The line is Jewish self-determination. The line is whether Jews, alone among the nations, are told their national liberation movement is inherently immoral. The line is whether the world's one Jewish state is treated not as a state with policies to debate, but as a sin to be erased. That is not criticism. That is discrimination. And it is exactly the kind of discrimination Nexus too often softens, explains, contextualizes, and launders into respectable discourse. This is why the Mamdani moment matters, but it is not really about Mamdani. It is about the reaction pattern. A political figure takes positions that many Jews understand, with reason, as hostile to Jewish self-determination or dangerously permissive toward anti-Zionist movements. Jewish organizations respond with alarm. Then Nexus enters, not primarily to ask whether the alarm might be justified, but to warn that the alarm itself is divisive. This is the move. Jewish fear becomes the problem. Jewish objection becomes the threat. Jewish clarity becomes extremism. And the anti-Zionist permission structure remains untouched, sitting there in the corner like the family secret everyone pretends is just furniture. Nexus says it fights anti-Semitism while protecting democracy and free speech. That sounds noble, truly. Put it on a tote bag. But when protecting free speech becomes protecting the political ecosystem that makes Jewish students unsafe, Jewish institutions vulnerable, and Jewish collective identity negotiable, we are no longer discussing civil liberties. We are discussing priorities. And the priority too often seems clear. Do not let anti-Semitism get in the way of the coalition. Do not let Jewish safety disrupt the narrative. Do not let Zionist Jews define the hatred aimed at Zionist Jews. That last one is the giveaway. Because Zionism is not some weird extracurricular activity Jews picked up at summer camp between boating and lanyards. Zionism is the Jewish national liberation movement. It is the insistence that Jews are a people, not merely a prayer group, a civilization, not just a trauma category, a nation with language, land, memory, law, longing, and the right to live without asking every empire for permission. You can oppose Israeli policy without opposing that. Millions do. But if your politics require the Jewish people to surrender the right every other people claims for itself, then spare us the lecture about nuance. You are not critiquing policy. You are objecting to Jewish equality. And when an organization consistently provides moral cover for that objection under the banner of fighting real anti-Semitism, it is not protecting Jews, it is managing Jewish complaints. There is a difference, a very Jewish difference. We know it because we have lived long enough to read the fine print. The fine print is where the danger always hides, not in the slogan on the poster, in the condition underneath it, not in the committee statement, in the assumptions behind it, not in the word justice, in who gets excluded from it. Anti-Semitism does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives revised, formatted, peer-reviewed, and introduced as a more careful framework. Sometimes it tells Jews, yes, hatred of you is wrong, but your peoplehood is complicated. Sometimes it says, yes, you deserve safety, but your sovereignty is provocative. Sometimes it says, yes, Jewish suffering matters, but please do not let it interfere with our politics. That is not moral clarity. That is the devious rebrand, and Jews are allowed to notice. If you enjoy my writing, support me by buying my book, Screaming into the Void, available on paperback or Kindle on Amazon.com.